We're going to talk about the Age of Exploration, which lasted from the 15th through the 17th centuries. And this is a direct outgrowth of the Renaissance, just as was the Protestant Reformation. The Renaissance encouraged a new spirit of adventure and curiosity. And while scholars and artists made new discoveries, ship captains were exploring unknown seas. Historians believe that the Renaissance spirit played a very important role in helping to launch the Age of Exploration. Like the artists of the Renaissance, the explorers were confident, ambitious, curious, and eager for individual glory. Renaissance thinker Alberti's proud boast, quote, "Man can do anything if he will," end quote, expressed a supreme confidence in the human ability to meet new challenges. Now, the Spanish are going to dominate exploration in the New World, but you might ask yourself, were they the first Europeans to come here? Christopher Columbus is given credit for discovering the New World, but did he? Actually, if you go back 500 years from Columbus's time, you'll see that other Europeans actually explored and even settled in the New World. This is the Vikings. The Vikings lived in what's today Scandinavia, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, up in the northern part of Europe. And they began running out of resources, especially timber, lumber, for their ships. And so they began venturing outward. A group of Vikings settled on the island of Greenland, on the island of Iceland, and some then broke off and went even further west and settled on Greenland, what's today Newfoundland. They called it Newfound Land, and the northern coast of Canada. And this was in the late 900s and the early 1000s, the late 10th century and early 11th centuries. Leif Erikson was one of the leaders of the settlement here in North America. And so technically the Vikings are the first Europeans to settle here. You might ask why they don't have credit, why they're not given the credit for this. Well, they lived here for several decades, but ultimately they're going to leave. Mainly it was because of Native American attacks. They just got tired of them. And so they packed up and moved back to Europe. They don't get credit because they did not leave a written record. And so we move forward for many centuries. We get to the late 1400s and Christopher Columbus's time, and the people who lived then didn't even know who the Vikings were. They're not able to read about them because they didn't leave written records, as I said. And so they were pretty much buried in history for many centuries. It wasn't until the 1800s that some of their settlements up in northern Canada were discovered, and people realized that, oh, okay, Columbus wasn't the first European, the Vikings were here. Here are the terms for the lecture. Make sure that you either write them all out or print them so that you have them, as we'll be talking about each of them as we proceed through the lecture. Here you see a map of Europe in the 15th century, the 1400s, and Spain, as you can see, is a very large country, and at that time, fairly powerful. The Spanish were the first Europeans to arrive in the Americas, and their early encounters with the native population are going to set a pattern of interaction that will continue in the centuries to come. At the same time, Spanish explorations and colonization are going to set in motion the modern global age. Not only did they bring into contact the peoples of Africa, Europe, and the Americas, but they began an exchange of plants, animals, institutions, values, and ideas that affects the world to this day. The age of discovery and encounter, or the age of exploration, made contact with other civilizations on a previously unequal basis. Europeans at the end of the Middle Ages knew less about the geography beyond Europe than did the Greeks and Romans. In fact, those early civilizations had carried on a thriving trade with India, China, and the Middle East. When the Ottoman Turks captured Constantinople in 1453, trade between Europe and the Far East stopped. Naval warfare, heavy tribute, and pirate activities in the Mediterranean prevented the Italian cities from continuing as European middlemen in Eastern trade, and so other routes had to be found. But the problem was that knowledge of the outside world was extremely limited. Ever since the fall of Rome, as I've mentioned, the Europeans were closed off from the outside world. When the Crusades began in 1095, for the first time, Europeans start venturing outward and making their way over to the east. Even after the Crusades, trade networks remained open, but it was over land. And people still didn't know that much about the world. But like I just said, after Columbus, in the 75 years following his discovery of the New World, more is going to be discovered about the world and its geography than had been discovered in the previous 1,000 years. And Europe's knowledge is going to be greatly expanded. By 1700, every ocean and every continent had been encountered and to some degree explored. Europe established mercantile empires throughout the world and demonstrated their superiority as seafarers and as warriors over all the people they encountered. So you might ask, what fueled this expansion of European power? Why now, in the 15th century, are Europeans ready to explore and move outward? Well, there's quite a few reasons. First, there's a general growth in population. Europe was pretty well explored and settled, so people needed to look elsewhere. In some areas, there's just too many people. And that means that they need more land to produce more food to meet the demands of this growing population. And so pressure begins to build for expansion. And because there wasn't a lot of available land in Europe, it meant that people needed to look elsewhere. Second, we have something called primogeniture. This was the practice of the eldest son inheriting everything. So that meant that if you had an aristocrat who had, say, 3 sons, his eldest son will inherit everything when he dies. The eldest son will inherit the land, the title, the wealth. The 2 younger sons will receive a small allowance, so they'll be able to live, but if they want to really live in the style to which they're accustomed, they're going to have to make their own fortune. And what better opportunity to do that than to join an expedition or even lead an expedition, because it gives the opportunity for accumulating land, for finding wealth. And so there were a lot of younger sons of aristocratic families who thought they had little to lose and a lot to gain by leading expeditions abroad. Then there's new technology. This is the Renaissance. There's new ideas. People are investigating, thinking, coming up with new ways to do things. And along with that comes new technology and the ability to use it. In the 1200s, it would have been nearly impossible for a European sea captain to cross 3,000 miles of open water and find the way home again. In the 1400s, though, it is possible for several reasons. First, shipbuilders designed a new vessel called the caravel. And this was a ship that was a lot sleeker than the previous bulky ships. It had 2 sets of sails also. One problem ships had was that they were totally dependent on the wind. So you might have a ship out in the middle of the ocean, no wind, or it's coming in another direction, and they're stuck. Well, the caravel had triangular sails for sailing into the wind. It had square sails for running before the wind, and these sails could be maneuvered in different directions. And its carefully designed hull could ride out an ocean storm. Two other inventions, perfected earlier by Muslim mathematicians and instrument makers, were essential for crossing the Atlantic Ocean. There were the astrolabe and the compass. The astrolabe was a brass circle with carefully adjusted concentric rings marked off in degrees. And using these rings to sight the stars, a sea captain could tell how far north or south of the equator he was. Without the astrolabe, Columbus would almost certainly have been lost at sea. And then there's the compass, which we use today to sight direction. It indicates where you're going, north, east, south, or west. Both of these instruments enabled ship's captains and sailors to navigate across the uncharted seas. When the early expeditions first began, merchants and shippers were anxious to join in on them. Ever since the Crusades, trade with India and China had been land-based and always conducted through a middleman. Goods were always imported indirectly. So if you look at this map, you see the route that was usually taken. The city of Constantinople would be the starting point over in the east for the middleman, and so quite often Europeans would travel to Constantinople, meet the middleman, hand over their list, here's what we want, and payment. Problem was, they got the goods, but they had to pay that middleman. So what were they after? There were a lot of goods in the east that were not available otherwise in Western Europe. Fine carpets, pottery, precious jewels, and more than anything, spices. European food was really, really boring. All they had basically was garlic and salt. So imagine a diet with no taste of anything but garlic and salt, spice-wise. That would get old really fast. And now, all of a sudden, Europeans have access to things like cinnamon and pepper and cloves, and these were big on the list of imports coming in from the east. And because people really, really wanted these goods, that put pressure on the merchants to get the goods to Europeans as quickly as possible. But they needed a middleman to cross the deserts and mountains. Usually Arabs or Chinese would bring goods over to Constantinople. European merchants were interested in finding direct routes to the spices and the east to cut out that middleman and to increase the profits. And in particular, they wanted to find a direct sea route because this would really be fast. So there's the desire to find a direct trade route with the East. Also, we have the increasing power of European monarchs. This is a period of time when monarchs are increasing state power. They are solidifying their power politically. We have a transformation in Europe politically as we move from feudal lords into more powerful national rulers. And there's a trend towards strong monarchical dynasties, especially in countries like England, France, and Spain. And here, in these countries, these kings enjoyed more loyalty from the people and better, if not total, control of the state's resources. That means that these kings or queens controlled, among other things, the money, the treasury, and they could use this to finance expeditions. You've got kings who begin to enjoy a lot more power than individual nobles. So when these initial discoveries are made, kings actually begin to compete with each other as they try to build the power of their national states. Then there's religion. There's the idea of going over to these new places and converting or Christianizing the natives. Christianity had always been a proselytizing faith that wanted to go out and save as many souls as possible from the hellfire of damnation. The Crusades left a legacy of hostility between Christians and Muslims. Led by Spain and Portugal, Europeans still hoped to reconquer North Africa from the Muslims, because North Africa at this point was majority Muslim. Europeans also believed that they had a sacred duty to convert non-Christians. And so we see missionaries setting out to convert the, quote, heathens, those who were not Christian. The Crusades, several centuries earlier, had been a major political and military movement inspired by Christianity, but they had not resulted in any long-lasting settlements outside of Europe. This movement that we're talking about now was far more successful. And we've got these European states now that are much more powerful than during the Crusades. So they're able to have a much stronger influence, especially in nations like Spain, which was extremely Catholic. Same with France. Also, bear in mind as we move into the 1500s, the Protestant Reformation is ongoing. And this is connected because the Catholics in the Catholic Counter-Reformation are going to want to go out and convert as many people as possible and bring them into the Roman Catholic Church. Remember, I mentioned the Jesuits and the creation of new orders. One of their functions was to go and convert. So as the explorers are coming to the Americas, they are bringing these missionaries with them, and these missionaries are working to convert the natives. Another thing that fueled the expansion of European power, the stuff that's there. There's the opportunity to secure gold, silver, gems, and other valuable commodities at the source, and to claim them for your country. And they found a lot of wealth to take. There was the opportunity to secure new territories. We see competition that had been carried on within Europe for centuries between various lords and kings, now being carried on outside of Europe. And actually, discovery just served as a ruse to plunder and an attempt to monopolize all the sources or the resources at their source. There's also the desire to satisfy the spirit of adventure and intellectual curiosity. You've got a lot of young men, for example, who just want to go explore. They want to see what they're going to find. They want adventure in their lives. And then finally, there's the desire to establish trading outposts and settlements. And we see this occurring with Spain, with France, and with England, as well as other countries. These movements that we're talking about are going to be very, very successful. And Spain especially is going to dominate, as I said. With these Europeans, the Portuguese who start the process, the Spanish who take over, they're going to be challenged by the Protestants. And they're going to feel this urgent need to go and spread Catholicism to people outside of Europe and to increase the base of Catholic faith. They felt that they were doing God's work, and this need to persuade and convert the natives is going to be a constant theme. So how does it all start? Well, the Age of Exploration actually starts with this guy, Prince Henry the Navigator. He was one of the most important early leaders. He lived from 1394 to 1460, and with Henry we see several of the factors I just talked about at work. He was the son of the Portuguese king. Interestingly, his name is misleading. He was not a sailor himself, but he actually was fascinated with navigation, and so he's going to sponsor or pay for the first expeditions. So he is going to jumpstart and launch the Age of Exploration. And there were several things motivating him. First, he was driven by missionary zeal. He thought that there needed to be a new crusade against the Muslims in Africa. Also, he was fascinated, as I said, with navigation. He started a school of navigation in Lisbon, Portugal. He also helped to design the caravel. And, as I mentioned first, there's the religious factor, missionary zeal, and at the same time, he wanted to explore Africa, both for trade and for religion. He was spurred on by some ancient legends. One thing that prompted Prince Henry to start financing expeditions was that he wanted to find Prester John. So who was Prester John? He was a legendary Christian king who supposedly founded a Christian kingdom in the heart of Africa. He supposedly created this utopia hidden away in darkest Africa, a place that was crime-free and peaceful, with rivers flowing with gold and even a fountain of youth. Stories had been circulating around Europe for centuries about Prester John, and he was supposedly a crusading knight during the Crusades who had gone down into Africa and established this kingdom. And during the Middle Ages, letters purportedly from Prester John circulated throughout Europe. So by the time we reach the mid-1400s in Prince Henry's time, you have people who truly believe that this guy existed. Now, we don't know if he did or not. He may have been a legend. He may have been based on a real person. But whatever the case may be, Prince Henry wanted to find him to unite with his kingdom and to overthrow the Islamic hold on Africa. That was one of his big motivations. And let me clarify, when I say he wanted to find Prince Henry or Prester John, obviously Prester John himself wouldn't have been alive, but he wanted to find that kingdom. So Prince Henry began financing expeditions, and they began exploring the western coast of Africa. And the first expeditions were just pretty disappointing, partly because Portuguese sailors were very superstitious, they're uneducated, and they were terrified that they would be lost in boiling seas filled with monsters. But Prince Henry continued to urge them on. And so the Portuguese began to explore and settle islands located off the coast of Africa, where they began to establish sugar plantations. And sugar became a cash crop. So what is a cash crop? It's a crop that you grow purely for profit. So they had these large plantations. They only grew sugar. They harvest it. They sell it. They take a small portion to put back into next year's crop. The rest is pure profit. And so a lot of those profits then are used to finance more expeditions. And they also began to see the rewards of trade when, in 1441, a Portuguese ship brought home some gold and a number of Africans as slaves. In the 1300s, the bubonic plague swept through Europe, and this caused a serious labor shortage. So, as a result of that, the slaves commanded a pretty high price. And during the next 60 years, the Portuguese will end up enslaving almost 50,000 Africans. Then, the Portuguese continued to move southward along the coast of Africa, establishing trading outposts so they could trade with the people on the interior of the continent. They weren't alone, though. They were competing against the Arab traders who were there first, and it became a bloodthirsty competition which required Portugal to take over certain areas by force, to drive out the competitors, and set up an imperial system of administration. They developed a system of plantations, where forced labor grew cash crops which paid, as I said, for more expeditions. What they did was set into motion some of the less pleasant aspects of exploration. By the time of Prince Henry's death in 1460, the Portuguese had established a series of trading outposts all along the West African coast. And even after Prince Henry died, Portugal continued this exploration, which was very profitable for them, especially in ivory and gold, and these goods were taken and then shipped back to Europe. The later Portuguese kings began to sponsor the same kinds of expeditions. Their ultimate goal was to find a sea route to China and India. Eventually, they are going to find that sea route, but it's going to be a long and dangerous trip. In 1488, a Portuguese captain named Bartolomeu Dias finally reached the southernmost tip of Africa, and this was the farthest that any European had gone to date. But his ships were so battered by high winds that Dias didn't go any farther. He named the spot there at the southernmost tip the Cape of Storms, and he turned around and went home. King John II of Portugal, though, was so pleased that he'd gotten that far that he renamed that place the Cape of Good Hope. And the Portuguese will then spend the next 10 years carefully planning for an expedition that will round the Cape of Good Hope, that will go even farther, and then reach India. Finally, on July 8th of 1497, a great crowd gathered in Lisbon, Portugal, to witness the beginning of Portugal's most ambitious voyage of discovery. Vasco da Gama, with a fleet of 4 vessels and 170 men, sailed away from the city, and 10 months later arrived in Calcutta, India. He sailed all the way down the west coast, putting in at various trading outposts, went through the Cape of Good Hope, and rounded the tip of Africa up to the eastern coast, and then explored the eastern coast on his way to India, the first European to do so. He makes it to Calcutta and finds that the city's shops are filled with rare silks, precious gems, and fragrant spices. He spends several months exploring all of this, traveling to other Indian cities, and filling his ships with sacks of cinnamon and pepper and other exotic goods. When he returned to Lisbon in August of 1499, da Gama received a hero's welcome. His remarkable voyage of 27,000 miles gave Portugal a direct route to India, and within a short time the Portuguese won from the Arabs control of the Indian Ocean and the rich trade with China and the Spice Islands. Vasco da Gama became the first European to sail around the tip of Africa and the Cape of Good Hope, and this was an incredibly important discovery. He demonstrated the potential for direct trade with the East, and for nearly 100 years Portugal enjoyed a monopoly on the spice trade. And even though down the road Portugal is going to claim land, overall what Portugal was really interested in was a trading empire. And so that's what they're working to build. And later on, explorers are going to go even farther, establishing trading outposts in China, Southeast Asia, and India. And Portugal is going to gain a very powerful trading influence in the area. But like I said, it never really tried to establish any kind of land empire because settlement was never really their goal. Originally, it's Christian zeal and then mercantile motives. And they had a very profitable trade in sugar, spices, and slaves. This trade was so profitable, in fact, that others wanted into the game, including the Spanish. Christopher Columbus was an Italian sailor who thought that he could sail west to get to the east, and that if he kept sailing west, he would find the Indies. And even before da Gama's historic voyage, Spain claimed to have found its own route to the east. Christopher Columbus went to the King of Portugal and asked for financing for his expedition. They said no. So he went to Spain, to Ferdinand and Isabella, the king and queen, and asked them. And by the way, these were the parents of Catherine of Aragon, Henry VIII's first wife. And they give him the money for an expedition. He gets 3 ships, and he is going to head over to the west. And he's going to, ultimately, as we know, find the New World. But he's going to end up bumping around the Caribbean and Central American coast and never actually realize what he's discovered. On August 3rd of 1492, Columbus and his fleet of 3 ships left Palos, Spain, and headed west into the uncharted waters of the Atlantic. He was using a map made by Ptolemy in the 2nd century. So you can imagine how accurate that was. During the next few weeks, brisk winds drove the fleet westward at a pace of about 150 miles a day. And with each passing day, his anxious crew became more and more nervous. Like I mentioned, these are uneducated men. They're very superstitious. And after more than 30 days at sea, the terrified sailors began to plot against Columbus. They wanted to throw him overboard. Luckily, they didn't. We go through August, no land. We go through September, no land. We move into October, no land. And his sailors are at the point of no return. They are ready to mutiny. And so Columbus convinces them. He says, "Give me 48 hours. If we don't spot land, we will turn around and head home." And to make it even more appealing, he offers a reward to the first person to spot land. Well, finally, just after midnight on October 12th, the man on watch spotted a branch covered with flowers floating in the water. And this was a sure sign that they were near land. And so hope soared as everyone eagerly began scanning the horizon, searching for land. And finally, early in the morning of October 12th, 1492, a lookout spotted land. Now, Columbus later claimed that he had actually seen that. He was like, "Oh, well, I saw that branch before I went to bed." And so he never actually gave the reward to the sailor. But later that day, Columbus and his men found land, they landed, and they claimed the island they were on for Spain. And he named it San Salvador, meaning Holy Savior. He had landed in the islands that are now called the West Indies. So Columbus landed in what's today the Bahamas, and it's actually unclear which island he actually stepped foot on first. One thing we do know is that he was so confident in making it to the east that he had actually brought along an Arabic translator. He's not going to be able to use them right now, though. Instead, he encounters the Taino people, and these were the natives of this area. Because Columbus was convinced that he had found a shortcut to the Indies, he called them Indians. The reality was that he was actually 9,000 miles east of the Indies. He had no idea he had actually discovered an entirely new hemisphere. The Tainos lived in villages and grew corn, yams, and cotton, which they wove into cloth. They were very friendly and generous towards the Spanish. Columbus reported that, quote, "They invite you to share anything they possess and show as much love as if their hearts went with it." And then he went on to write, quote, "How easy it would be to convert these people to Christianity and to make them work for us." And that's exactly what happens. They are converted, and then they basically become slave labor for the Spanish, who use them to mine for silver, to work on the plantations they establish. And the friendly relations soon evaporate. Columbus is going to end up making 3 journeys to the New World. He never actually steps foot on North America itself. Instead, he explores the islands on his first journey, Central America, and then later South America. And like him, those who follow in his wake are going to claim land for Spain, seize the gold ornaments and other wealth worn by the Tainos, and enslave them and make them pan for gold and work on the plantations. Here you see a map showing Columbus's journeys, his first expedition, which brought him to the islands off the coast of North America, and then his 3 later voyages, where he will explore further south. And he continued to believe that he had discovered the Far East and a direct route there. Later discoveries are going to prove Columbus wrong, but nevertheless, his voyages are very important because they help to propel Spain into the forefront of European exploration, conquest, and settlement. From Cuba, Spanish explorers probed the coasts of the Americas. They spread stories of empires rich in gold. Attracted by the promise of riches, as well as by religious zeal, a flood of adventurers soon followed. Bernays Diaz del Castillo, a Spanish soldier, later noted, quote, "The conquistadors acted in the service of God and His Majesty, and to give light to those who sat in darkness, and also to acquire that wealth that most men covet." So he comments on this desire for wealth, but also on the fact that they are converting the natives. As he says, they are giving light to those who sit in darkness. When Columbus first reached the Americas, it was not clear what lands he had found. Portugal suspected they might be lands that Portuguese sailors had reached first. And so soon there's a rivalry that brews between Spain and Portugal, and this rivalry continued to grow and to fester until it reached a dangerous level. In 1493, Pope Alexander VI ruled that Spain and Portugal might divide the so-called Indies. He ordered a line drawn from north to south through the Atlantic Ocean. And please understand this is an imaginary line. All newly discovered lands east of that line would be Portugal's. All such lands west of this line would be Spain's. In 1494, Spain and Portugal agreed in the Treaty of Tordesillas to move the line a few degrees farther west. Explorers later found that the mouth of the Amazon River lay east of that line, and this gave Portugal claim to the river and all the lands around it. And in 1500, a second event strengthened Portugal's claims to the area. A Portuguese sea captain named Pedro Alvares Cabral explored the forest along the mouth of the Amazon River. His men cut down a tree and found that the wood was as red as a glowing coal from a charcoal brazier, and they called it Brazil wood, from the Portuguese word for a brazier, and hence the name of the country that Portugal later colonized. Vasco de Balboa was a Spanish explorer who led the first land expedition which explored the whole area of South America and discovered the Pacific Ocean. He was the first European to see and to stand in the waters of the eastern shore of the Pacific Ocean on September 13th of 1513. He accomplished this after an arduous trek through the jungles of what is now Panama. He claimed the Pacific Ocean and all its shores for Spain, and that opened the way for Spanish exploration and conquest along the western coast of South America. So he's credited also with founding Panama, which became the first permanent European settlement on the mainland of Americas. Balboa may have discovered the Pacific Ocean, but it was the Portuguese explorer Magellan who actually gave it its name. The waters seemed to be calm and peaceful, so he gave the ocean the name Pacifica, meaning peaceful. Magellan was encouraged by Balboa's success, and between the years 1519 and 1521 he made an even more spectacular discovery when he circumnavigated the world and proved beyond all doubt its geographic parameters. Magellan sailed down the coast of South America, got almost to the tip of the continent, and discovered a natural water passage that allowed him to sail from the Atlantic to the Pacific. This was named the Straits of Magellan. He sailed across the Pacific to China and East Asia. Eventually, he made it to the Philippines, and sadly, he died there. He and his men were caught in the middle of a war going on the island, and they were killed by unfriendly natives. But remainders of his crew continued the expedition and made it back to Spain in 1521. Only 4 of the original crewmen made it back to Spain. He started out with 232 sailors, he started out with several hundred sailors, and 230 sailors actually died on the expedition. Only 4 of the original crewmen remained to make it back to Spain, and they picked up sailors along the way at the various ports at which they stopped. But this event was probably the single greatest feat of discovery in this entire age, and it proved beyond a doubt that the world was round. Now, it was a very long voyage, and because the entire trip took 2 years, it made it a very impractical route to China and India, but it showed, as I said, that the world was round. And so those people that still believed in the superstitious idea of the world being flat, of being able to sail off the edge into a boiling cauldron, were proved wrong. Spain was not just interested in trade. Spain wanted to settle people and build a vast empire. Spaniards also discovered and plundered some wealthy pre-existing civilizations, such as the Aztecs and the Incas. And the Spaniards sent expeditionary leaders called conquistadors. And these were soldiers who were fired by something you can remember as the 3 Gs: God, gold, and glory. They were fired by a greed for gold, a desire to destroy or at least convert the heathens and gain their souls for Christ, and just a generalized quest for glory, to establish new territories for the crown and to make a name for themselves. So picture this. The Indians assembled on the beach, as the strangers from across the sea had asked them to do, and they listened silently as the young Spanish captain read the requerimiento, or the requisition. This was a document drafted in Spain, and it claimed the Indians' land for the Spanish king and queen as earthly representatives of the Catholic Church. If the Indians accepted the authority of these rulers, the document stated, quote, all would be well. If they did not, punishment would be swift and severe. It stated, if you do not do this, we shall take you and your wives and your children, and make slaves of them. We shall take away your goods, and shall do you all the mischief and damage that we can, as to vassals who do not obey, and refuse to receive their lord. Scenes like this were repeated across South America and the Caribbean in the early 1500s. And if you think about it, one of the big problems that occurs here, especially in the beginning, is that this document is read to the natives. They don't understand the language, so they have no idea what is being said to them or what they are being forced to agree to. Now later on there will be translators, but initially we don't see that. And we see a flood of Spanish explorers, settlers, and missionaries who followed Columbus to the Americas. Wherever they went, they claimed the land and the people for their king and church. If the native people resisted, the invaders imposed their will by force. As loyal Christians, they believed it was not only their right, but their duty to bring their civilization to the Indians. One of the most well-known conquistadors was Hernando Cortez. He is known for defeating the Aztec Empire. He had earlier participated in an expedition in Central America, and he had heard about this wealthy empire to the north. So he was determined to go and find it and to conquer it and to take the wealth for himself as well as the land. So here you see the Aztec Empire. The area in mustard color, the core states, that's the capital of the empire, and that's the initial core area of the empire. And what the Aztecs had done over the years was they had begun to conquer their neighboring peoples and incorporate them into their empire by force. Most of the neighboring people were tributary states, meaning they were part of the empire, not by choice, and they were forced to pay tribute to the Aztecs. And then in the center of the empire you have allied states, and these are people, tribes, who felt that, well, if you can't beat them, join them. And so they have an uneasy alliance with the Aztecs. But as you can see, the Aztecs are controlling a good portion of Mexico. And so what Cortez does is, against direct orders, he sails his ships into the Gulf of Mexico, disembarks with his soldiers, orders that the ships be burned so that they cannot turn back, and they begin marching across Mexico. Cortez was very shrewd. He knew how to use things to his benefit, and he had translators with him. As he marches across Mexico, he's encountering these various tribes of people who really dislike the Aztecs, and he makes alliances with them. He basically tells them, hey, you don't like the Aztecs? You come with me, fight with me, help me to defeat them, and you can gain some freedom for yourselves. So as he's marching across Mexico, he's gaining a huge army. So why did these people hate the Aztecs so much? Well, various reasons. One, like I said, they're forced to be part of this empire, forced to pay tribute. Also, the Aztecs believed in numerous gods. Primary among their gods was the sun, as in the sun in the sky. They believed that the sun was a god. Every night, he slept. In the morning, he rose again. He needed strength to rise. And if the time ever came when he did not have the energy, the strength he needed, he would not rise. That would be the end of the world. And so, how do you give a god strength? Well, what the Aztecs did was they gave him blood. They practiced human sacrifice. Where do they get their sacrificial victims? Some were actually Aztecs who volunteered, but the great majority of them were prisoners of war, taken from the various tribes conquered by the Aztecs. So what that did was set into motion a cycle where the Aztecs constantly need a supply of victims, so they are constantly at war to conquer more territory and more people to gain more victims. So that is a big reason why these people despise the Aztecs. So Cortez and his men are marching across Mexico, headed towards the capital. Timing and luck were really on Cortez's side. There were several things that really helped him. One was the alliances he forged. Another was the fact that all the omens and signs that the Aztecs read pointed to the fact that a god king called Quetzalcoatl was going to return. Quetzalcoatl was a god king who many, many years before had gone. But now everything points to his imminent return. And back in the capital, word starts to filter in that Quetzalcoatl is approaching. He has a large army with him. He is glowing in the sun. Why would they think he's glowing in the sun? Well, it's the armor that Cortez and his men are wearing. Word says that he can tame demons. So why would they think he can tame demons? Because of the horses the Spaniards had. Horses were not native to the Americas. The Aztecs had never seen a horse before. They were brought over here by the Spaniards. And so when the Aztecs saw these horses, they thought they were some type of demon that the Spaniards were able to control. The Emperor Moctezuma didn't really think that this was Quetzalcoatl, but he also didn't want to tempt fate, and so he invites the Spaniards into the capital city. The Spaniards were invited into the capital city of the Aztecs, and they were just amazed by what they saw. From the emperor's palace, one soldier wrote, quote, "We had a clear view of the 3 causeways by which Mexico communicated with the land, and of the aqueduct which supplied the city with the finest water. We can see the majestic temples of the nearby cities, built in the form of towers and fortresses, and others all whitewashed and wonderfully brilliant. This city was unlike anything the Europeans had ever seen. It was very large, 1 million inhabitants. There were no cities in Europe that large at that time. It was also very clean, something that was also very different from the European cities of the time. And the Spaniards were just amazed at the splendor. At the same time, they were really disgusted and turned off by the sacrifices. The Aztecs performed thousands of sacrifices a year, and the Europeans could see this from their guest quarters. They could see the great temple. They could see the almost constant sacrifices, and they were totally disgusted by them. One really interesting thing about this city is that it was built on an island, and what the Aztecs did was they built causeways or connecting roads and bridges to the mainland. They also found a way to farm. They built islands and connected them to the bottom of the shallow lake, and then grew their crops on these floating pieces of land. And so they figured out a way to make this surrounding, or these surroundings, work for them. And now the Spanish are there in the capital, and the Emperor Moctezuma, thinking that Cortez might be his lost god, welcomed them and invited them to stay. Cortez repaid him by taking him prisoner, and he and his men attacked the Spanish and tried to take over the city. They do not succeed, and they end up being forced out of the city itself and back onto the mainland. The emperor himself will later be attacked and killed by his own people. His people felt that he had betrayed them by bringing these strangers into their capital. Well, what Cortez ends up doing is going back to the mainland because he's forced there, and he and his men build a fleet of European-style ships. They have cannons hauled in from the south, mount them on the ships, return in 1521, and after a brutal struggle, they capture, and he's also using Indian allies, by the way, but they capture and demolish the capital city. An unknown Aztec lamented, "And all this happened to us. We saw it, we were amazed. With this lamentable and sad fortune, we see ourselves anguished. Broken spears lie in the road. We have torn our hair with grief. The houses are roofless now, and their walls are red with blood." The Spanish won because of their superior ships and weapons. They also had timing on their side. When they had been guests of the Aztecs nearly 2 years before, they had unknowingly carried smallpox into the Aztec capital, and after they left, an epidemic spread through the empire, decimating the population. So when the Spaniards return, yes, they have superior weapons. They have cannons, firearms, body armor, fighting against spears. But they're also fighting a weakened population, a smaller population, because of the epidemic. And in the end, the beautiful city was completely leveled, and a new Spanish-style city was later built over the ruins. And this city, still standing today, is Mexico's capital, Mexico City. Cortez's success inspired other adventurers, and among them was Francisco Pizarro. Between 1531 and 1533, he defeated the Aztecs, about 10 years after Cortez. Earlier, Pizarro had crossed Panama with Balboa, and he had heard stories of a rich South American empire. In 1531, he sailed from Panama with 180 men and 27 horses to conquer it. Well, just as with Cortez, timing was really on Pizarro's side, because when he arrived in Peru, he was pleasantly surprised to learn that the Incas had just fought a bloody civil war. The emperor had died, and his 2 sons went to war against each other, fighting for the throne. The civil war had just ended, one of the brothers had been killed, and the new Incan emperor, Atahualpa, had not yet entered his capital. He decided to delay his journey in order to meet the Spaniards, and Pizarro used this opportunity to take the emperor prisoner. The emperor tried to buy his freedom by filling 2 rooms, one with silver and one with gold. And when the ransom was paid, he was given a choice. He could become a Christian and be strangled to death, or remain a heathen and be burned at the stake. He converted and was strangled, probably wondering why he had fought so hard to take the throne away from his brother. Most of the Incan warriors had been killed during the Civil War. Without a leader, those who were left were helpless, and Pizarro and his men easily captured them and their capital. And over the next year and a half, they will conquer the rest of the empire. Pizarro himself will end up claiming Peru, and he will become the first governor of Peru. Sadly for him, he had a lot of enemies and was assassinated in 1541. But from Peru, Spanish forces surged across lands once ruled by the Incas in Ecuador and Chile, and before long, Spain had added a lot of South America to its growing empire. The Spaniards also began moving northward, conquering territory. In 1513, Juan Ponce de Leon landed in Florida. He landed on April 2nd, which was a holiday called the Feast of Flowers, or Pascua Florida. And he gave us our name, Florida. And like I said, this is April 2nd. It's usually around the Easter season. And Florida became part of the Spanish Empire. After Ponce de Leon explored Florida, the French also began to come and explore, and they began to explore the northern part of Florida, north of what's today St. Augustine, and in that general vicinity. So in 1562, Pedro Menendez de Aviles was sent by the Spanish to drive the French out of Florida. And in 1565, he established the city of St. Augustine. And it was given the name St. Augustine because it was August 28th of 1565 when he first sighted the land. And that date just happened to be the feast day, a special holy day of St. Augustine. And so the city of St. Augustine is established, and it will become the first permanent European settlement in North America. And here you can see the route taken by Menendez as he establishes St. Augustine and then begins traveling northward, exploring as he goes. He ordered that a fort be built to protect St. Augustine from the French, who he had driven out, and also from pirates who were prevalent in that area. And here you see the cross marking the spot where Menendez supposedly first came ashore. And this is an area that's very close to us here in Jacksonville. So I would encourage any of you, if you have the time, to go down and check it out. There's a lot to see, a lot of history down there. And here you see New Spain. As I said, Spain is after a land empire. And as you can see by this map, they are well on their way to creating one. They are controlling a lot of territory. The conquistadors were granted what were called encomiendas. This was a delegation of authority by the Spanish king. It specified that the conquistador ruled in place of the Spanish king. It gave absolute authority, at least within that area, to people like Cortez and Pizarro, to these conquistadors. And they used their power to destroy great pre-existing cultures. Sadly, and ironically, under the original intent of the encomienda, the natives were to be considered citizens with full rights. Sadly, though, that's not what happened. Because the Spaniards came, they established plantations, they found mines, and they needed workers. Because, well, they didn't want to do the work. And so the native people were enslaved and forcibly converted to Christianity. And they were used as a mass local labor force to farm the land, and most importantly, to mine for gold and silver. The Spanish quickly subjugated the native peoples, plundering their lands and their wealth. The Spanish justified this with the view that the natives weren't originally Christian, and particularly after witnessing the mass human sacrifices conducted by the Aztecs and the lack of traditional civilization by other natives, they believed them to be savages and not deserving of possessing the New World. And so, in the conquest of the Americas, the Christian duty to evangelize non-believers took the form of often forced conversions of Indians and other pagans at the hands of Roman Catholic priests. As I said earlier, as the conquistadors come, so do the Jesuits and the other orders. They come specifically to convert the natives as they encounter them. Christianity was also used to justify the state's policy of enslavement of Indians and the often violent pacification of native communities who resisted. The European view of the inherent right to conquest and domination in the New World was captured in a declaration addressed to Indian populations known as El Requerimiento, the requirement. And this is something that I mentioned earlier, and it was issued in 1513. It was believed that Native Americans resisted conquest and conversion for one of two reasons: malice or ignorance. The requirement was meant to eliminate ignorance. It also provided religious and legal justifications for the confiscation of New World territories and the subjugation of their inhabitants. A member of the conquistadors' force would read the requirement in Spanish before a group of Indians. Sometimes it would be translated, sometimes not. Most of the time the natives had no idea what was being said, but the symbolic act of reading the document relieved the Crown and its agents from legal and moral responsibility for the conquest, enslavement, and killing of Native Americans. Readings were often dispensed with prior to planned attacks. So how do we explain European success? Well, as I've said before, the Europeans had superior technology. They're coming armed with cannons mounted on ships, firearms, body armor, horses. They're fighting against spears. It's really no fight. And then there's disease. The Europeans unknowingly brought diseases with them. Over the centuries, they had built up immunities to diseases like smallpox. But the natives had no immunity to these European diseases, and so they died by the millions. In the space of 1 century, the 16th century, 90% of the native population died. This caused Spain a huge problem because there goes their workforce. And this is what's going to cause Spain to begin to import black slaves from Africa to do the work. And so the slaves from Africa start coming over to the New World to replace the native populations when they begin to die. Now, we will talk in a little about the African slave trade, but I just want to say that by the 16th century, when this begins to take place on a large scale, the African slave trade had actually existed for a long time. Muslim Arabs had long been involved, and later the Portuguese. But in the 16th century, the Portuguese and Spanish begin increasingly to exploit the slave trade. European traders would buy slaves from rival tribes. Many of them were prisoners who'd been taken as a result of warfare with rival tribes. We also see the Europeans very good at exploiting rivalries. So think of Cortez exploiting those tribes he encountered as he marched across Mexico, forging alliances with them against the Aztecs. So what are the results of all of this? Well, during the 1500s, the 16th century, there is a constant flow of gold and silver to Spain from the New World, because, as I said, Spain is dominating in the New World. The result? Spain becomes the most powerful nation in Europe. Unfortunately, they, as the saying goes, put all their eggs in one basket. The great majority of this gold and silver is used to finance the Spanish Armada built by King Philip. In 1588, the Spanish Armada is destroyed, and along with it, much of Spain's power. We also see the Columbian Exchange. This refers to an exchange of goods and ideas between continents. For example, from the New World, we have items like potatoes and corn being brought to Europe and Asia and Africa and changing those places. Think of Ireland. The staple food item became the potato. Think of the potato famine of the 1840s. Potatoes were not local to Ireland. The potato also becomes a staple food item in China, brought from the New World. Same with corn. We have goods being brought from Europe to the New World. Horses, for example. As I mentioned, horses were not native to the New World, but they're brought by the Spaniards. Many of them, over time, will escape and go into the wild and repopulate and eventually be captured by native tribes. When you think of a lot of Native American tribes, especially the Plains Indians, you might think of these warriors on horseback hunting buffalo. Their entire way of life, their entire culture revolved around the horse and hunting. However, this is a culture that developed after the introduction of the horse. And we also see food items brought from Europe and other places to the New World. For example, oranges and peaches. We have the peach state, the orange state. Well, those fruits are not native to the New World.
We have tobacco being brought from the New World to Europe and other places and profoundly changing those cultures. And then we have slaves from Africa being brought to the New World and changing Africa as well as the New World. And so we have numerous continents involved in this exchange, and all of these places being changed as a result. Plants and animals are introduced, which also lead to better diets. We have overseas empires. We have monarchs who, as I said earlier, were competing with one another to build the biggest, best empire. And now they're expanding their power overseas with the creation of these empires. The way of life changes for Native Americans. They lose their freedom. Their populations dwindle. They become slaves to the Spanish. And everything changes for them. And then we have continents coming into contact with one another and being changed as a result. As a result of the age of exploration, all of the continents around the Atlantic came in regular contact with one another. This development brought far-reaching changes on both sides of the Atlantic. In Europe, the changes were generally welcomed. For the peoples of the Americas and Africa, though, life was brutally disrupted. Many Indians believed that the disasters they suffered marked the end of the world. To the Aztecs, the destruction of their capital signaled the end of the reign of the sun god. "Let us die, then," the Aztecs lamented, "for our gods are already dead." As the pattern of disease and conquest was repeated across the Americas, Native Americans continued to resist the invaders. For years, for example, the Mayas in the Yucatan region of Central America fought Spanish rule. Long after the death of the Incan emperor, revolts erupted among the Incas. Resistance did not always take the form of military action. Throughout the Americas, Indians resisted Europeans by preserving aspects of their own culture, their language, religious traditions, food, clothing, and skills such as weaving and pottery. Spanish conquests in the Americas would bring changes to peoples and cultures around the world. And many societies are going to be profoundly changed as a result of this. The success of the Portuguese and the Spanish brought other new powers into the game. By the 17th century, England, France, and the Dutch were all involved in exploring the New World. The Dutch and English began to displace Portugal in the East, not on behalf of the kings, but on behalf of great private commercial enterprises. Trading companies, such as the East Indian Company, would eventually monopolize trade in the East. And if you watch Pirates of the Caribbean, you'll be familiar with this company. Because the trip around Africa was so long, there continued to be a desire to find a shorter passage to the east. And a lot of people thought that maybe there was a Northwest Passage. Legends of the Northwest Passage fueled many expeditions, especially by the English and French. They thought that there was a Northwest Passage that cut across northern North America through Canada, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And although no direct route was ever found, the knowledge gained by the English and French led to English and French settlements in North America and future and continued colonization. The French did not find the Northwest Passage, but in 1535, a French explorer by the name of Jacques Cartier discovered a broad river that he named the St. Lawrence. While sailing up the St. Lawrence, he discovered a large island dominated by a hill. The island's inhabitants called their home Hochelaga. He renamed it Mont Royal, later called Montreal. And this is important because his voyage became the basis for France's claim to a huge interior region called New France, So he lays the foundation for that. In 1608, another French explorer, Samuel de Champlain, sailed up the St. Lawrence hoping to start a colony. He located a promising site below a high bluff overlooking the river. He named his new colony Quebec, after a Native American word meaning the narrowing of the waters. The colony soon became the center of a thriving fur trade. And then Champlain used Quebec as a base to explore more of the region. He was an expert cartographer, and he drew a very accurate map of eastern Canada. He was also an accomplished navigator, and he made 23 voyages between New France and France. His policy of cooperating with the Native Americans in the fur trade brought a lot of wealth to France. Linked to the French by trade, tribes like the Huron and the Algonquin Indians also became allies in France's quest for land and trade. And so one thing to know about the French is that they did create a land empire, but their focus is on trade. And so they're going to create a large empire, but parts of it are going to be sparsely populated, and it's mainly going to be trading outposts and military forts. In the summer of 1673, a fur trader named Louis Joliet and a priest named Jacques Marquette set out to explore what we know as the Mississippi River. They wanted to see if it would offer the long sought-after Northwest Passage. After traveling more than 700 miles downstream, they were very disappointed to discover that it flowed into the Gulf of Mexico. And so they realized this is not the Northwest Passage. Later, though, a young French nobleman named Robert La Salle is going to realize that this river is very important. This river offered a central highway for an inland empire. You could sail through the continent from north to south. In 1682, he sailed down the Mississippi River to the Gulf of Mexico, and he claimed the entire region for France. He named it Louisiana in honor of King Louis XIV. The French dreamed of building a great French empire in North America. So they want to create this large empire, and they did create a huge territory. You can see the area in blue, that's New France. Along the eastern seaboard, the area in pink is England, the English colonies, and then the area in orange is New Spain. Well, they did claim a huge territory, but it remained thinly settled. This is because, like I said, you've got a lot of traders and trappers coming in as opposed to a lot of families. Plus, the French government insisted that only Catholics could settle in North America, so that eliminated a lot of people. New France had only about 80,000 settlers in 1750, but the founding of New Orleans in 1718 and forts along the Mississippi and Great Lakes established France's claim to a huge inland empire and a thriving trade in furs. The French had a pretty good relationship with the Native Americans they encountered, but they also believed that it was necessary to convert them to Christianity. And for that purpose, Catholic missions were built to promote the faith and convert local people to Christianity. These missions were often established on trade routes and became gathering places for travelers and local inhabitants. The Jesuits especially were active in converting the Native Americans. A French Jesuit missionary wrote in 1642, quote, "To make a Christian out of a barbarian is not the work of a day. A great step is gained when one has learned to know those with whom he has to deal, has penetrated their thoughts, has adapted himself to their language, their customs, and their manner of living, and, when necessary, has been a barbarian with them, in order to win them over to Jesus Christ." Even though the French had somewhat good relations with the Indians, they still tended to view them as their inferiors, though. And at the time of European contact, all but the simplest indigenous cultures in North America had developed religious systems that included creation myths, transmitted orally from one generation to the next, which supposedly explained how those societies had come into being. Also, most native people worshipped an all-powerful, all-knowing creator or master spirit, a being that assumed a variety of forms in both genders. They also venerated or placated a host of lesser supernatural entities, including an evil god who dealt out disaster, suffering, and death. Because Spain and France were establishing their empires, England decided they wanted to get involved. And the first English settlement was on Roanoke Island. This is an island off the coast of North Carolina. And this location was chosen because it was deemed to be a good vantage point from which to see the Spanish activity to the south in Florida, and also to prepare to be aware of pirate activity. And so in 1585, the first group of settlers, all men, came to Roanoke Island to settle. And they found it to be a very harsh area. It was a very difficult winter, and it didn't last. Some of them made it through the first winter, but then went home. They just didn't want to make it work, didn't feel that they could. Well, in 1587, a second group comes to settle. This group included men, women, and children, families. And they are going to settle and try to make this colony work. John White was the governor of Roanoke Colony, and his daughter and her husband were among the second group of settlers. And it was here in Roanoke that his daughter gave birth to a little girl, Virginia Dare, who became the first English child born in the New World. Well, he got them established, and then John White sailed back to England to get more supplies, and he was going to return later that year. Unfortunately, he returned to England just as England was going to war with Spain. The Spanish Armada occurs, we have warfare, and John White's delay is, he's delayed. His return is delayed by more than a year, by a couple of years actually. When White finally does return, he finds nothing. The colony is gone. No people. No clue as to what happened to them, except for a word carved onto a tree. The word Croatoan was carved onto a tree. This colony became known as the Lost Colony because they were lost. We don't know, even to this day, what happened to them. So here you see the actual word carved into the tree, Croatoan. So what does it mean? Well, there are many different theories. The Croatoans were a tribe of Indians living on a neighboring island. And one theory is that the colonists ran out of supplies, were trying to make it through a very harsh winter, and actually left to go and join with the Croatoan Indians. However, this was never proven. As I said, there were really no clues left behind except for that word carved in the tree. There were sightings over the years to follow of blue-eyed Indians living in that region. So it is possible that they did go maybe to the mainland, maybe to one of the neighboring islands, and ended up integrating into this culture. There was not evidence that they were attacked because there were no clues showing that there had been a battle, fighting. There were no bodies. We just don't know. So Roanoke is the first English settlement, but it does not last.
It's going to be more than a decade later, nearly 2 decades later, that the English will found their first permanent English settlement. And this is Jamestown, named after the king, James. It was founded in April of 1607. Jamestown is in what's today Virginia, and it is located on what was named the St. James River. Now, the colonists discovered, once they began to settle, that this land was very marshy, and it was swampy, and there were mosquitoes everywhere. And so, initially, it was a very harsh environment, and it was a very difficult settlement. Part of the problem was that the first group of settlers who came were men, and a great majority of them were younger sons. If you recall, I mentioned the idea of primogeniture, that idea that the eldest son inherits everything. Well, you had all these younger sons here who were looking to make a fortune. Many of them have never worked a day in their lives. They're certainly not interested in cutting down trees, clearing land, building shelter, farming. In fact, many of them actually brought gold kits with them, and they spent their days searching for silver and gold. What that means, however, is that work isn't getting done. You know, you come to a new environment like this, you've got to start from scratch and do everything. If you want shelter, you've got to clear the land, cut down the trees, build it. If you want food, you've got to hunt. You've got to clear land, plant your crops, tend to your crops. None of that was being done. And as a result, that first winter was very, very harsh, and a great majority of the men died. More settlers will come, including Captain John Smith, and he is going to take charge of this fledgling colony, and he's going to turn it around. He told the men, "He that shall not work shall not eat." And basically what he's telling them is, if you want food, you're going to have to earn it. And so he, I guess you could say, whipped them in shape and turned everything around and started to make a successful colony. And here you see a representation of the original settlement of Jamestown there on the river. Now, why would they be on the river? Well, the river provides water. It provides a highway, transportation. This will be very important when they start producing goods, because they can load them onto their ships and sail them right down the river into the ocean and across to England. There were natives living in the area, the Powhatan tribe, and initially relations were pretty good between the settlers and the natives. They tended to work together, and in fact the natives even helped the settlers to an extent, helped show them how to farm and so forth, so that they could survive. Unfortunately, the Indians are going to start getting a bit nervous when the settlers start taking more and more land. What's going to happen is that a crop is going to be brought, or I'll say a plant is going to be brought to the Jamestown colony that's going to transform it. And this is the tobacco plant. It was being grown in New Spain, but they actually had a law forbidding anyone from taking it out of New Spain. But some of the plants were smuggled out, brought to Jamestown, and the settlers discovered that they grew wonderfully in this marshy land that they had. And this is going to be the beginning of the plantation system in the American South. They are going to start building tobacco plantations, and this is going to turn around this colony. It's going to become a thriving colony, and the colonists are going to realize they need more and more land so they can grow more and more tobacco and make more and more money. And this is going to have several results. It's going to cause them to start expanding and taking even more land than they had originally told the Indians they needed. And this, in turn, makes the Indians very uneasy. another byproduct of this is that they need workers to work on these plantations. And initially, they're going to have indentured workers, and I'll talk about them in a minute, but ultimately, they're going to end up using slave labor from Africa. And so this will be the beginning of slavery in the English colonies. The natives, meanwhile, getting very nervous. And it leads them to the brink of war because they see more and more land being confiscated by the English, and they don't like it at all. Many of you may have seen the Disney movie Pocahontas. If you did, just know that, well, it's Disney. It's an enjoyable movie, but it's not necessarily historically accurate. There are elements of truth in it, but a good many scenes are Disney. There was, however, a Pocahontas. As the native tribes, especially the Powhatan tribe, grew closer and closer to the brink of war, more and more frustrated with the colonists and their demands for land, John Smith is captured, going to be executed, and the story goes that the chief's daughter, the teenaged Pocahontas, pleads with her father to let him live. He does, and an alliance of sorts is created when Pocahontas marries another colonist by the name of John Rolfe. And supposedly they were very happy. Now, John Rolfe, by the way, is the colonist who first brought tobacco to Jamestown. And he and Pocahontas will later travel back to England, and she will actually become a minor celebrity there. Everybody wanted to see this young Indian princess, and she will have 2 children, and sadly will die at a very young age in England. Jamestown, meanwhile, is going to grow and thrive, largely due to the influence of tobacco. And it will set the stage for more settlers coming, more settlers establishing themselves, and all throughout the South what we're going to see are plantations being built. And so the South is going to end up having a plantation economy, and it starts right here at Jamestown. One incentive that was used to get colonists to come to the English colonies was the headright system. And this was a policy where each arrival, each person, received 50 acres of land, and then another 50 acres was given for each family member brought. So this was a great incentive, especially for people who didn't have a lot of money. It was a way to come over to the New World and start a new life. Many of the first settlers who came were also indentured servants. Say you're living in England and you want to go to the New World, start a new life, but you can't afford the passage. Well, you could indenture yourself. So what that meant was you could sign an agreement with somebody who would pay your way to the New World, and in exchange you would work for them, usually anywhere from 4 to 7 years. And they would provide room and board for you during that time, perhaps train you in a trade, and then at the end of your servitude you gain your freedom. And so most, or if not many, or if not most, of the first workers to come to the New World were indentured servants. Later, as this starts dying out, we're going to see slavery gaining steam. Here you see an actual ad for indentured servants for the Virginia colony. A young man who understands Latin, Greek, and mathematics to serve as a tutor in a gentleman's family. A lad who has served an apprenticeship as a surgeon to live with one of his own profession, and then others. So you can see that there was a wide variety of opportunity available to people, and so you had some indentured servants who actually had training in certain areas, and then others who were blank slates, so to speak, and who came and served as apprentices and actually learned a trade, and then
later, when they gained their freedom, many of them could use those skills they learned and set up their own businesses. While we see people coming to settle in the southern English colonies and build plantation systems, in the north we're going to have people settling who are searching for religious freedom. And the first group to come are the Pilgrims, and they will establish the second permanent English settlement in the New World. Now, the Pilgrims were actually Puritans, and the Puritans were those who wanted to purify the Church of Catholic elements. The Pilgrims stood apart from them because they actually left the church. And there was a group of Pilgrims who had gone to Holland to lived there for several years, and then left because they felt that their children were just picking up bad influences from the Dutch. And so they were given a charter to come to the New World, and they end up settling in Plymouth, Massachusetts. And later, about 10 years later, the Puritans will come and establish the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So the Pilgrims were given a charter to settle in the New World, and their original charter actually gave them permission to settle further to the south. But they were blown off course because of just some bad storms, ended up off the coast of Massachusetts. And after kind of bumping around the coast for a while, looking at different locations, they finally settled on an area known as Plymouth. It became known as Plymouth. They named it that after the city from which they sailed in England. And they end up founding the Plymouth Colony. Like I said, this is the second permanent English settlement in the New World, and they establish it in 1620. The Pilgrims sailed on the ship the Mayflower. It was men, women, and children, families, coming over here searching for a place where they could live and worship in freedom. Before the Pilgrims went ashore, they realized they had a problem. Their original charter called for them to settle further south. They were out of the boundaries of that charter. And a charter was special permission that was given for people to come and settle in a certain area. And a charter would usually lay out the guidelines for settlement. Well, the Pilgrims didn't have that. So the men wrote the Mayflower Compact. And this became the first self-government in the New World. It basically laid out their plan, their guidelines, their laws. And then all of the men on the ship signed it. And they did this again before they went ashore. The first governor of the Plymouth Colony was William Bradford. And he discovered right away that this was going to be a difficult task, because they land in this area that is very different from what they're used to. And the Pilgrims discovered, for example, that it was really hard to farm in this soil. The soil was very sandy, and there were shells, and they couldn't get anything to grow. And that first winter, many of them died. It was called the starving time. And a huge percentage of the Pilgrims died. And so Bradford was trying everything he could think of to try to make this a successful colony, or at least get them through the winter. What ends up saving the Pilgrims are some Native Americans. There was a tribe called the Wampanoag tribe, and they were friendly. And there were three warriors in particular: Samoset, Massasoit, and Squanto. They ended up befriending the Pilgrims, and they showed them how to survive in this new world. They showed them farming techniques that would work in this sandy soil. They showed them how to use fish as fertilizer in that soil. And they showed them how to survive, how to farm, how to get what they needed to make it. And they did.
And that is one reason every November the United States celebrates Thanksgiving. The Pilgrims held a feast. They held this jointly with the natives who had helped them, and we commemorate it as Thanksgiving. They were giving thanks for their native friends, for survival, for making it through that first year, and looking forward to the future. Today we have turkey and dressing and sweet potatoes and all the fixings. That first Thanksgiving would have been a bit different. They would have had fish, pheasant, different types of wild game, most likely not turkey, corn, maize, and other things. And this is the beginning, as I said, of this tradition that we carry on with even today. And the Plymouth colony is going to survive. This colony is going to survive. Unfortunately, it's never going to be hugely successful. The Pilgrims are always going to struggle. In fact, after a decade in existence, or after being there for a decade, there's only going to be one plow still in the entire colony. So they're never going to be wealthy. But they were here, they were free, they could worship as they please. 10 years after the Pilgrims arrived, the Puritans came to Massachusetts and settled a little further north from Plymouth, and they established the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And this, unlike the Pilgrims, is going to end up being a very successful colony, partly due to the Puritans' work ethic. Not to say the Pilgrims didn't have it as well, but the Puritans will just have more advantages. The first governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony was John Winthrop, and as he led his people over to the New World, he had a vision for what he wanted to create. He said, "For we must consider that we shall be like a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are on us." So what is he talking about? Well, he's saying that they, the Puritans, are going to establish this city, and when he says the eyes of all people will be upon us, they are going to set the example that others will follow. At least that's his vision. And so the Puritans come also searching for religious freedom, and we are going to see what's called a great migration over the next decade. You're going to have thousands and thousands of Puritans coming and settling, and the Massachusetts Bay Colony is going to become very large, very successful, very, very profitable. In fact, one of the major cities here is going to be Boston. The Age of Exploration marks the beginning of a period when Europe dominated much of the world. That period lasted more than 400 years, from the 1500s to the 1900s. The people of Europe had gained political mastery over two huge continents, North and South America. Europeans were also the undisputed rulers of the ocean routes across the Atlantic. Africa, the Americas, and Europe were now all bound together by new economic and political ties. Until the mid-1900s, Europe controlled those ties for its own advantage, and we will see in a few weeks where that will lead.